To paraphrase Winston Churchill in 1940, what EdExcel called Paper 1 is over. I expect that Paper 2 is about to begin. If you're watching this, there's every chance that you have just or recently sat the Paper 1 exam for GCSE History. Now it's time for this video of my Paper 2 predictions for this year 2024 for the EdExcel GCSE History exam. The topics I'll be covering will be Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, early Elizabethan England, the American West, and Superpower Relations. These are all topics that I'm very familiar with and I've done a lot of work on in the past. I've also got good data on these papers as lots of people have sat them, so I feel much more confident making predictions based on these papers. They represent the vast majority of entries for the EdExcel GCSE. If, however, your topic is not covered here, I can only apologise. I'm really sorry about that, but I'd rather not include them than make poor predictions and a less useful video for you. So again, if that applies to you, please do accept my apologies. Now that's out the way, let's get into it. Let's remind ourselves of the structure of the Pearson EdExcel Paper 2. The 2024 exam will take place on the afternoon of Tuesday the 4th of June. It'll consist of a British depth study, for example, Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, circa 1060 to 1087. There'll be 3 questions to answer here. The first, A, will be to describe 2 features for 4 marks. Then you'll have to explain why for 12 marks. And then you get a choice between 2 different 16-mark questions. Both will ask you how far you agree with a particular historical interpretation. There'll also be an additional 4 marks attached to this question for spelling, punctuation, grammar, and the use of specialist terminology. Because 20 marks are attached to this question overall, you will get a choice of 2, so you can pick the strongest one for you. The second part of the paper, usually included in a separate booklet, is a European or wider world period study. For example, the American West, circa 1830 to circa 1895. For this part of the exam, you'll have to explain 2 consequences for 8 marks. And you'll have to write a narrative account of a particular event or theme for another 8 marks. Then you'll be presented with 3 questions where you explain the importance of one thing to another. You'll have to choose 2 out of these 3 questions, again picking the ones which are best for you. So that'll be a total of 16 marks for question 3. The total time for this paper is 1 hour and 45 minutes, and you should make sure that you've got both of the booklets that you need before you commence. Next, a very brief and personal appeal for your help. Have I helped you? If the answer to that is yes, then please help me to help others. I am actually a full-time history teacher and a head of department, so this is hardly my full-time job. Originally, these videos were just made for my students, but now I know that they help thousands of others too. If you want to thank me for my work, and it does take hundreds of hours overall to put together all these revision videos, then please do subscribe to the channel. The fact of the matter is that after the GCSE exams have finished, I have a massive fall off in the number of views and subscribers to my channel. And that's only natural, I suppose, as people want to move on from their GCSE studies. However, that's difficult to explain to the YouTube algorithm, and it really harms the channel. If you do want to thank me, then subscribing is a great way of doing that. And importantly, staying subscribed after you finish the exams is also a great way of thanking me for my hard work. If you could do that, I'd be tremendously grateful. Okay, that's my begging out the way. Let's get to the predictions themselves. I will give a note of caution though. I did the same thing for the Paper 1 predictions video, and the same applies. These predictions are more a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018, some of which in fact haven't appeared at all. Exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly, and in fact some of the topics that have never appeared would still have been relevant to some of those questions, even if they weren't named. The only way of being really sure is to try and know everything. Yes, at this stage I'm sure that's not what you wanted to hear, but it does happen to be true. So this is how you can use these videos. Don't just focus your revision on the predictions. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know that you are weak on, use that to guide your revision. So if there's an area that repeatedly comes up and you know you're weak on that, you might want to brush up on it before the exam. Similarly, if there's an area that you know is a weakness for you and it's never appeared on the exam, maybe this will be the year, so you might want to focus your revision in that direction. So let's get on to the first of our British depth studies. Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. Let's consider last year's exam. What came up? The 4-mark describe question was describe 2 features of the career of Bishop Odo. There were lots of people thanking me on the video for Bishop Odo that year, I can tell you that. The explain question for 12 marks was explain why William I ordered the harrying of the North 1069 to 70. The stimulus points you were given were the Danes and York. The 16-mark answers were as follows. The main reason for King Harold's defeat at the Battle of Hastings was his poor leadership. How far do you agree? The stimulus points were Harold's march to Hastings and Norman preparations. This was an incredibly popular question and a bit of a gift for anyone who knows the Battle of Hastings well. The other question was, the main consequence for the introduction of the forest was more income for William I. How far do you agree? The stimulus points here were royal land and forest laws, although I'm pretty sure that would have been obvious for anyone reading this question. This was a far less popular question, but actually had some really high quality responses attached to it. Ultimately, even if one question seems more obvious, if you're really confident on one of the answers, be confident enough to answer that particular question, because chances are fewer people are going to answer it overall, and it'll probably be marked accordingly. But ultimately, you just choose whichever question you're most comfortable with. Now we've had a look at the 2023 paper, let's consider what particular topics have appeared time and again. The March at Earldoms has appeared in the sample paper and both the 2021 and 2022 exams. Castles in various descriptions and forms have appeared in 2019, 2020 and the 2022 exam. And the Domesday Book and Domesday Survey have appeared in the sample paper, the 2019 exam and in 2022. These are obviously big topics and they do lend themselves well to various styles of question within this exam. So could they appear again? Or is it time to let some of the other topics get a look in? Again, a note of caution here, but the following have never appeared in the Anglo-Saxons and Normans exam, although I would remind you, pretty much all of these might have been mentioned as part of other questions, but they've not had a distinct and discrete question for them. One is on Anglo-Saxon society, its structure, its roles, and how people ruled. Another is Harold Godwinson's Norman embassy. This is a pretty fascinating topic and a key part of the lead up to the Battle of Hastings and the succession crisis of 1066, so perhaps it's quite surprising that this one has never come up before, although it would have been mentioned in other questions. Less surprising is Harold Godwinson as king. That's never appeared, but then again, he was only on the throne from January to October that year, so how much can you really write about it? But again, it hasn't technically appeared before. Then there's another quite surprising one. The early rebellions to Norman rule from 1068 to 1070. The rebellions, for example, up in the north by Edgar the Atheling, etc. These are quite complex and they're quite easy to mistake as well. So it's quite surprising that these haven't come up before. They would be a great way of sifting between people who had just sort of broad knowledge and really specific knowledge of the topic. So again, that might be a good one to revise if you are a little bit, shall we say, shaky on the specifics of those different rebellions. But what about the things that have appeared before but perhaps have not appeared for a while? The following have all appeared only rarely. Power of Anglo-Saxon kings. That came up in the 2018 exam only, which was the first publicly sat paper of this particular exam. Also the rebellion of Hereward the Wake. This was on the sample paper only, but it's a cracking story if you don't know it. Perhaps the biggest surprise for something that's rarely appeared is the feudal system, which has only appeared on that first 2018 exam, but is a massive part of how William controlled England. Yes, it would have been mentioned in other questions, but it's not had its own question before. Similar in scale is the Norman Church, another important part of how William established his control. This has only been shown in the sample paper only. So, considering the different topics that repeatedly appear, and those that either rarely or have never appeared, which ones are you going to focus your revision on? Good luck. Now let's move on to the next British depth study. Early Elizabethan England. Last year's exam in 2023 had these questions. Describe two features of government in early Elizabethan England. That's for 4 marks, but quite a broad question, so quite a nice one to give. The 12-mark question was explain why Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587, with the stimulus points the Privy Council and Mary's claim to the English throne. Again, that was quite a popular question. People felt it was fairly fair. The 16-mark questions were as follows. Political rivalry with Spain was the main reason for direct English involvement in the Netherlands in the years 1585 to 88. How far do you agree? The stimulus points here were the threat of Spanish invasion of England and Protestantism. The second option was new technology was the main reason why exploration by the English increased in the years 1558 to 88. The stimulus points here were navigational instruments and Sir Francis Drake. If I remember rightly, it was this second question which was marginally more popular, but I don't think there was so much in it. Okay, which one would you have chosen? Well, I wonder if these topics will come up again in a different guise, or because they had so many marks attached to them last year, perhaps they're going to be rested for some time now. Let's consider what might appear. In terms of the repeated inclusions, things that have appeared at least 3 times, we've got the religious settlement. This is Elizabeth's compromise between Catholics and Protestants early in her reign. That's appeared on the sample paper, the 2020 exam and the 2021 exam. Although that's multiple times, very few people sat the exam in 2020, so maybe this is one that is due to be repeated. I'm not sure. Mary Queen of Scots is a really big part of the course, so it's hardly surprising that she's appeared in the 2019, 2020 and 2023 exams. Related to that are the Catholic plots. The Babington plot and the Revolt of the Northern Earls specifically have come up before. These have appeared on the sample paper, the 2020 exam, the 2021 exam and the 2022 exam. But there are other plots that you could go for example the Throckmorton plot or the Ridolfi plot. Perhaps it's the turn of some of those other plots. This is again a really broad area, so hardly surprising that it's come up time and again. Finally, English involvement in the Netherlands. That's appeared in the 2021, 2022 and 2023 exams. Are they going to be rested this year, or again could this broad topic be the focus of another question? I'm not so sure with this one. What about my predictions for 2024? Well, let's consider what has never appeared on the early Elizabethan England exam. Please do bear in mind though that again, just as I said for the Anglo-Saxons paper, many of these things, or probably all of these things, could have been included as content for other questions, but they've not had distinct and discrete questions set on them. Firstly, key ministers and privy councillors. The Spanish Armada. That's perhaps a bit of a surprise. The rise of the gentry within the social structure of Elizabeth's England. The economy and reasons for poverty. Bear in mind that there have been questions on how Elizabethan England dealt with poverty, but not on its causes and background, so that might be a little bit different. As for the topics which have only rarely appeared, Catholic challenges to Elizabeth has only rarely appeared. This has appeared in the sample paper and also the 2019 paper, but it is quite a big topic and it is deeply related to the Catholic plots, which of course have been the focus of many papers going forward. So I almost didn't include this one, but I thought it was worth mentioning for completeness. Also, increases in poverty has not been included before since the sample paper, which of course was not publicly sat. Again, like I say, how Elizabethan England dealt with poverty has been included, but not the increases in poverty and the background behind that. Elizabethan theatre is perhaps a bit of more of a surprise, being so related after all to your English literature studies. It's appeared in the 2019 paper only. Is it due another go? I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll move on to our period studies now. Our first topic is the American West. Let's have a look at last year's exam. The first question was explain 2 consequences of new technology for farmers in the American West for 8 marks. The next question was to write a narrative account analysing the developments in the spread of the railroad network in the years 1862 to 1875. The stimulus points were, fairly obviously, the Pacific Railroad Act, not sure that was a great help to anyone, and immigration. Otherwise, this was a fairly fair question, I think, compared to some narrative accounts that we've had in the past. Moving on to the explanation questions, you were able to choose from these. Explain 2 of the following. Explain the importance of horses for the Plains Indians' way of life. Explain the importance of John Iliffe for ranching on the plains. And explain the importance of the Battle of the Little Big Horn, 1876, for US government policy towards the Plains Indians. The Rest is History podcast has just released a series of episodes on this. Shame they didn't do it last year. Will these things appear again this year? Well, perhaps not. As we're about to see, there are absolutely loads of topics that have never been touched before. So let's get into them. There's only one topic which has been repeatedly included, and that's the development of the cattle industry. The sample paper had this as the consequences question. The 2019 exam had this as the explain the importance question. And the 2022 exam included this as the narrative account question. So you can see that it's been shared between the different question styles within the paper, even though the sample paper, of course, was not a public released and publicly sat exam. But what that does mean is that there are loads of exam topics which have never appeared. They've probably been relevant to the paper or relevant to other exam questions, but they've never had their own distinct and discrete examples. So let's go and have a look at them now. These topics have never appeared. Does that mean this is their year? I'm afraid there are quite a few here, which might not help you narrow down your revision, but let's have a look at what they are. The first is quite a surprise, the Donner Party, surely the most disastrous incident of westward migration, or at the very least the most famous and gruesome, and yet it's never appeared with its own distinct question. Nor have problems with settling on the plains. Problems of farming more specifically, yes, but not the more wider problems with settling. Conflict between indigenous peoples and settlers on the plains has also not appeared in a distinct question of its own. Nor has the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. But be very careful here. A couple of years ago there was a question on the 1862 Fort Laramie Treaty, so that one has appeared. They are, remember, different treaties, so familiarise yourself with the differences. Crime and lawlessness has never featured as its own distinct and discrete question that I can find, which again quite surprising as it's quite a big topic. So whether that involves Wyatt Earp, who has I think appeared on a separate question discreetly, or whether you're looking more generally at the problems of enforcing law enforcement on the West, it's quite a big topic and it's not really appeared very much. Relations between ranchers and homesteaders has not come up with its own distinct question either, although the Johnson County War, which is related to this, has. The Oklahoma land rush as a late example of settlement of the plains has not been included before, although there have been questions on other late examples of settlement like the Exodusters. The closure of the Indian frontier as a concept has not been covered either, although again it would have been relevant to certain questions. More surprisingly, the famous massacre at Wounded Knee has not been covered. Life on the reservations for indigenous people has also not been covered. So any topics looking at the destruction of the Plains Indians or indigenous people's way of life might be a good one to look at for this year. But look, that is quite a big long list, and actually that's an indication of just how narrow some of the questions can be in this particular exam. After all, you're only answering questions on 4 different topics, and it's a big course. In terms of those topics which have only very rarely appeared, well, there aren't anything like so many. Abilene, the famous cow town, has appeared on the sample paper, but let's be honest, it has been relevant to the cattle industry questions since, so I almost didn't include this one. Perhaps more significantly is early conflicts with indigenous peoples. I mean in this respect Little Crow's War and the Sand Creek Massacre. There was a famous, or should I say notorious, narrative account question on this in 2018. It had a very narrow date range, had some really weird and specific stimulus points to it, and generally speaking candidates did really poorly on it. It was an absolute pig of a question, to be honest with you. But remember, if you encounter a question like that, everyone's in the same boat, so try not to worry too much. Perhaps it's time that these things will be looked at again. I can't, of course, be sure. So that's my look at the American West. What's appeared multiple times, what's never appeared, and what's only appeared rarely. Where are you going to focus your revision? Now let's have a look at the next period study. Superpower Relations. Last year's exam. The first question, explain 2 consequences, was 2 consequences of détente in the 1970s. That was worth 8 marks. The narrative account question was analysing US-Soviet relations in the years 1945 to 47. Quite a narrow date range there and a really early one. That probably caught out a few candidates. Is it going to appear again? The stimulus points for this here were the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and Cominform in 1947. The explain the importance questions look like this. Explain the importance of the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955 for superpower relations. Explain the importance of Soviet relations with Cuba for tension between East and West in the 1960s. And explain the importance of the USA's Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, for US-Soviet relations. That would have been in the 1980s. So which of these 3 8-mark questions would you have chosen? Remember, you are required to answer 2 of them. Will any of these things reappear this year, or is it time for something else? Let's have a look at the repeated topics. These topics have all had repeated inclusions, at least 3 times. Let's start off with the Grand Alliance at the end of World War II and the conferences of that period. The 2019 exam included a question on Potsdam, the 2021 exam included one on Tehran, and the narrative account question of last year's exam looked at the Yalta Conference as part of it. It's hardly surprising that this one keeps cropping up because it is really broad, and perhaps one of the other conferences will be looked at this year, I don't know. Cuba and Soviet relations has also cropped up plenty of times. 2018, the Bay of Pigs invasion was discussed. The 2019 exam had a question on the Cuban Revolution, and the importance question in 2023 also included work on Cuba. Détente has also picked up quite a few times. So 2018 narrative account question was on this, the 2021 importance question was on this, and the consequences question of last year's exam also looked at détente. And the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets has also crept up quite a bit as well. So the 2018 narrative account question looked at this, the 2020 importance question, and the 2023 consequences question last year looked at this too. The next one again is one of these broad topics, so again not surprising that it's come up a few times. The presidency of Ronald Reagan. The 2019 exam had a question on the Second Cold War. That was the explain the importance question. In 2021 there was another question on the Second Cold War, but also with the Strategic Defence Initiative including two. That was for the narrative account question. And then the 2023 exam, so last year's, looked at SDI again and the importance question. So having looked at what has appeared time and time again, let's consider what hasn't appeared. Much as certain topics lend themselves to the questions really well and therefore appear multiple times, there are of course others which have never appeared. However, do bear in mind that many of these would have been able to be included as content for lots of other questions, but they've never had their own distinct and discrete questions attached to them. Ideological differences, communism versus capitalism. That's really about the context of the Cold War, so perhaps wouldn't be likely to have a question that's distinct. But of course, the moment I've said that, it'll come up this year, won't it? Maybe not though. Kennedy's Berlin visit of 1963, which would be a really good one for consequences, has never come up. The consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis has also never come up. The Cuban Missile Crisis has come up in other forms, but not in terms of its consequences and outcomes. International reaction to the Soviets in Czechoslovakia has also come up before. Yes, there have been other questions on, for example, Brezhnev doctrine, but not the international reaction. Similarly, there have been lots of questions on Ronald Reagan and on Gorbachev's policies, things like New Thinking, but their relations as a pair of world leaders have not been discussed in a discrete question before. Also, we need to consider those things that have only rarely appeared. These include the Hungarian uprising. This was the narrative account question in 2019, but has not appeared since. Brezhnev doctrine appeared in the 2018 importance question, which remember was the first exam sat on these topics, and so it's been a good long while. Perhaps it's due another go. Also, the fall of the Berlin Wall, despite being such a famous event, and looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's not appeared since the 2018 exam either, although it would have been relevant to certain other questions. So that's the end of the Superpower Relations predictions. Will one of these rarely appeared or perhaps never appeared topics come up, or is the exam board going to fall back on one of the really common topics which lend themselves so well to those questions? Use this, remember, to help you focus your revision. Finally, before I sign off and say good luck, bear these things in mind again. Remember that these predictions were more actually a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018, but also they show that exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly. The only way of being sure is to know everything. And you might not want to hear that, but if you're watching this video, the chances are that you're doing some revision. The more you do, the better, and it's never too late. Don't just focus your revision though on these predictions. Instead, if a prediction appears to be on an area that you are weak on, use this to guide your revision. So if it's a topic that very frequently comes up, because after all, like I say, certain questions really lend themselves to it, and you know you're weak on that, then you'd better revise it. Similarly, if it's something that's never appeared and you know that you're weak on it, it might be a good idea to make sure you address that weakness. My final bit of personal advice is this. Once the exam is done, move on. Get on with your revision for paper 3. Discussing exams after the event is rarely helpful regardless of what the topic is. And I've seen this with my own pupils. Sometimes someone mentions something and another pupil goes, oh no, why didn't I mention that? Or perhaps they realise that they completely messed up a question with a very silly error. The fact of the matter is we all hope that this doesn't happen, but it can. So what would you rather? That you know about it and then you sweat about it all summer? Or that you've just got on with things and you've focused on what you can control? Because after all, like I say, Once the exam is done, you can't do anything about it. That's the end of this video. Aside from saying the best of luck to all of you, I'd like to thank you for watching this video and thank you for your support for the channel. Remember what I said about subscriptions, likes and interactions really helping small content creators like me when the algorithm gets confused. So on that note, thanks for watching, good luck and goodbye.